Introverts are not worse language learners than extroverts, but not using opportunities to communicate can slow you down. Here are some methods I've used to compensate for this as an introverted learner. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. This week's episode is for all the introverted language learners out there, although I'm sure extroverted language learners will also find something useful. I would certainly describe myself as an introverted learner, so the ideas in this episode are based on my own experience of what works for me. Naturally, I've also taught and coached many introverted students, and so the ideas I share here are the ones that seem to work the best. Before we get to that though, I have two announcements to make. The first is that there is a listening challenge on for January, and it starts on January 10th. But as usual, if you listen to this later, you can still head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com and see what challenge is available when you are listening. These challenges are meant to help you improve your Chinese through daily practice and friendly competition, so it's completely free to join. You set a goal for how much to listen for the rest of January, and you record and log progress, and you can interact with other people in the challenge. Second, as those who listened to last week's episode already know, I have created a listener and reader survey you can still fill out, and this will help me guide my work so I can provide more and better help for learning Mandarin. The survey takes only 5 to 10 minutes to fill out, and you can find it at hackingchinese.com/reader-listener-survey in one word, or you can just follow the link in the description. I'm very grateful for the answers I have already received since last week, but I think it's important to hear from as many as possible to get a clearer and more nuanced view. That being said, let's spend the rest of the episode talking about language learning for introverted students. The first thing I want to say that being introverted doesn't mean that you're a bad language learner, and there are in fact indications that show the opposite, i.e. that introverted people tend to reach higher levels of proficiency in foreign languages if they stick to them and commit to them, of course. As usual, how much Chinese you learn is dependent on the three factors: content, i.e. what you study, method, how you study, and the most important one, how much time you spend. And your personality is important here because it will determine what you find easy and what you find difficult to spend time on. So extroverted people will find it easier to talk to others and communicate in Chinese in real-life situations, whereas introverted people, myself included, find this quite difficult unless we know the person in question already. On the other hand, introverted students might find it easier to spend lots of time just listening and reading, and this is also extremely important for building proficiency, and it might even be more important in the long run. However, when you read success stories about people learning Chinese very quickly and so on, they usually involve advice like start speaking from day one and take every opportunity you can to talk with real people and things like that. And I just can't do that. I don't enjoy talking with random people. I find it very difficult to strike up conversations about nothing with someone I've never met. If I have a reason to talk with someone, or if I know them, or if there's a natural topic to talk about, I can do that. But simply giving me the advice to speak with every Chinese person I meet simply doesn't work. When I looked around a little bit for definitions about introverted versus extroverted personalities, this seems to be a bit tricky, but one definition that stuck with me is that introverted people need to invest energy into hanging out with people and socializing, whereas extroverted people gain energy from doing that. And at least from the introverted side, this seems rather accurate. I do think that actually communicating in Chinese is a very good guide to what you should focus on. It tends to highlight what you cannot say, what you cannot write, and so on. It also allows you to experiment with the language and see what doesn't work, which is very tricky to get just from reading and listening. So I do think that there is call for talking about compensating for these things as an introverted learner. So it's not that advice about speaking more Chinese in real-world situations is bad advice, it's more that introverted students will not heed this advice, no matter how heartfelt the advice is or how effective the method would be. Before we go into some concrete methods that I've used successfully to get around this, I should say that listening and reading really are important, much more important than speaking and writing. So if you spend most of your time listening and reading, that is fine. I'm not saying you should stop doing that. I'm just saying that real-world communication in Chinese is important too. So, method number 1 is to use writing as a stepping stone. First, you can chat with people or send text messages to them before you actually meet them and need to talk to them in person. This means you get more time to think, and there is also more distance between you and the other person. This also works for learning new words, so you read and listen and you hear and you see this word being used, then you type it when it comes up in a conversation, and then finally you use it in a spoken conversation. And this feels much less insecure than going directly to guessing how it's used in a conversation. I don't know if other introverted students share this feeling or not, but I've always felt very insecure about using words that I don't really know. So if, say, a teacher tells me what a word means, I'm then not willing to use it in a conversation immediately. I want to know more about the word before I'm willing to use it in my own production. So method number 2, I've actually already mentioned, but it is listening and reading a lot. And I want to reiterate that it's not a problem if you spend most of your time listening and reading. If you think about it, it's a little bit weird to think that you will learn new things about a language simply by speaking and writing yourself. Well, you might get better at some things you already know, you might be quicker, for example, but if you want to expand your mental model of how the language works and also expand your vocabulary and so on, reading and listening is what counts, not writing and speaking. Naturally, most people speak in a conversation, and then you also listen to what the other person says and you can get feedback and so on, so speaking is still valuable, but not as valuable as you think. Method number 3 is to listen as much as you can. And this is not exactly the same advice as I just said, it's actually something quite different. If you spend enough time listening, you will build the confidence to also say these things. So this is not so much about building the mental model of the language, vocabulary, and so on. It's more about building the confidence. So if you've heard something said 100 times and you feel confident of how it's used, then you will also feel more confident actually using this word in a conversation. Method number 4 is to speak in a controlled environment. As a student, you have probably experienced this many times. Some people are easy to talk Chinese to and others are not. Some people make you feel rather comfortable and some not so much. So when you find a teacher or language exchange partner or just a friend who's willing to practice with you, one of the most important criteria is that you feel comfortable speaking with them. And this can be about personality, it can be about their way of speaking, their way of teaching, or whatever. It doesn't really matter what causes you to feel comfortable or not comfortable, but if you don't feel comfortable with someone, you need to find someone else to talk to. Method number 5 is a great example of how technology can help introverted students, namely in the form of voice messages. So to be clear here, I refer to functions in chat services where you can record an audio message and send it to someone. I use these all the time, not just in Chinese, but some of you might not. The good thing about voice messages is that you can prepare for them a little bit before you record. You can also change your mind halfway through and discard it if you said something wrong or don't know what to say, and you can also cut your message up in several pieces without it being awkward to listen to. This is great because it's an intermediate step between the chat messages we talked about earlier when you just type and the real conversation. Because you're not doing it synchronously, so you can take your time and so on, but you are still speaking rather than typing, and this is of course much closer to having a real live conversation. If you want to know more about using voice messaging as a stepping stone to Chinese conversations, we did talk about that in episode 60. And as usual, even though I haven't said that so far in this episode, I will put links to the things I talk about in the show notes so you can check out articles or other podcast episodes. Method number 5, speak to yourself. This sounds a little bit strange, and people will think you are a little bit strange if you do it in public, but this actually works rather well. Like I said earlier, part of the reason why speaking is useful is because it helps you speed up the retrieval of the words necessary, you get quicker at putting them together into sentences, and so on. And this actually works rather well even if you are not talking to anybody at all. Naturally, talking to yourself is not very scary either. Depending on your level, you can name things in your environment, describe things that you're doing, or maybe have your inner monologue in Chinese. Method number 7 is about narrowing the focus. So if you were to ask people who learn Chinese in China what they are most comfortable talking about, it's probably why they are learning Chinese. And why is that? Well, it's because all Chinese people ask this question all the time. So if you've lived in China for a year, you might have told this story 50 times already. And that makes you quite good at it. This can be used in many other areas, of course, and you can deliberately create situations where you will have similar conversations over and over, obviously with different people. For example, when I needed to buy a new desktop computer when I lived in Taiwan, I went to several stores and asked exactly the same questions about computer parts. This meant that I had the same discussion with maybe 10 different people, and the first time I found it really hard to keep track of what was going on, and it was just a mess. But when I had done it 10 times, it wasn't that bad. Naturally, I had studied Chinese for many years when I did this, so I'm not saying that would work for a beginner, but there are different ways you can do this at lower levels too. For example, if you are okay with asking directions, but you still feel it's very difficult, you can ask for directions to the same place many times. So you just don't go there, you just ask the next person, how do you get here? And especially if you yourself already know the answer, having this conversation becomes much easier. Now, I know that many will think, no, I don't want to have these conversations, I don't feel up to it, so having 10 of them doesn't really help. But you can have these with people you trust first, you can simulate a certain situation and you can go through it beforehand, and then you go out and try it live, as it were. My 8th and final method for introverted students is to use various forms of apps. In particular, I'm interested in apps that allow you to be a little bit more active yourself, maybe put together your own sentences, actively make choices, and so on. So for example, at WordSwing, where we normally create text adventure games for Chinese learners, we've also created an activity that tallies quite well with what I talked about earlier about asking directions, where you get to hear descriptions and then have to match certain pictures and small parts of maps with what's being said. And this is certainly more active and you can do things many more times than you can in a textbook, where you maybe get one exercise and you probably need a friend to practice it with too. I don't have a complete list of apps that can be helpful in this regard, but I do have Hacking Chinese resources where I've linked to more than 500 resources sorted by level, topic, and type. I think that concludes this episode, and I hope that these methods and ideas will help you leave your comfort zone as an introverted learner, because there really are some advantages to doing that. However, I also want you to remember that being an introverted learner does not mean that you're bad at language learning, it just means that you're learning in a different way. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.